So we're excited for our panel on the impact of generative AI on elections and democracy. I'll invite to the stage first our moderator, Merve Haycock, President, Center for AI and Digital Policy, Rebecca Tromble, Institute for Data, Democracy and Politics at George Washington University, Caio Machado, Instituto Vero, and Marielza Oliveira, UNESCO Communications and Information Sectors Division for Digital Inclusion, Policies, and Transformation. We also have online Paul Nemitz, Principal Advisor at DG Justice, European Commission. Off to you, Merve, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here and for Center for AI and Digital Policy to hold the opportunity to collaborate with the Future Society and co-host the event. I really appreciate all the work that Nico and the amazing team behind the scenes have done. Why are we here today? Why we have this panel? In 2024, around 3.9 billion people, which is roughly 48% of the world's population, are scheduled to have general elections. This also represents 59% of the world's GDP, 5 countries with nuclear power, and I counted 54 countries that actually have major and general elections. Not to say anything about the local elections, right? They're just as vulnerable. So election tampering, disinformation, misinformation, those were not obviously, didn't start with generative AI, but generative AI added a second layer of scaling in disinformation, facilitating cybersecurity attacks, pollute the information ecosystem. And we are seeing new threats that impact elections, trust in institutions, and democracy at large. So to discuss the issue, I am honored to be moderating this panel with leaders and scholars from around the world to discuss some of the dynamics in the United States, Brazil, European Union, as well as UNESCO's work on the space as well. So first, I'm going to go individually to each of you, and then we'll wrap up with more deliberative questions. Rebecca, we've been discussing throughout these 2 days, we've been discussing how large language models present risks, how they're black boxes, how we can't trace, contest some of these outcomes. Considering your expertise in political communication and digital research ethics, what do you see as the biggest concern? I know that's not a...
There are so many. Yeah, it's difficult to say what the biggest concern is per se, but for me, my starting point always is this notion of transparency. There's been, I think, a bit of a mythos around machine learning and large language models for quite a long time now, although it's really only in roughly the last year that we've heard the public discourse around LLMs per se, right? But there's long been a conversation and considerations about the role of machine learning and the problems of, right, the black box of machine learning. And to be frank, I think that this is a little bit of hype that is convenient all too often for the producers of these tools and of these systems. There are, in fact, ways to crack open those black boxes. Machine learning, including large language models, can be constructed in ways to make them more transparent than not. But what we're looking at is a situation where the vast majority have been constructed in a way where the intention was not transparency from the beginning. And so we're a bit on a back heel, trying to understand first and foremost what is the training data that has fed into these, and then how are the models ultimately generating, right, the outputs that they're providing. I think the starting point for us, given that we're in a world now where most of the very impactful LLMs have not been built from a standpoint of transparency from the very beginning. I think then what that means is now we have to start doing more sort of things like using auditing mechanisms and so on, and crucially, making sure that independent auditors, independent researchers, and so on have better access to both the models themselves and to the underlying training data. I don't know if all of you saw, but just a couple of days ago, there was a report released that showed that ChatGPT, when prompted in a particular way, can leak a ton of its underlying training data. Now, I think that can be really problematic in a number of ways, but I think it's also very helpful for us to indeed start to work to try to crack open these black boxes. So for me, transparency is always the starting point as we're looking to think about, one, what are the risks that these models present, and two, crucially, how can we mitigate any of those risks going forward? But three, how do we inform the public? How do we ensure that the public really understands what these tools are and what sort of impacts they might have?
Thanks so much for that. And I think coming back to your last point on transparency and understanding of the public's literacy, we have the elections, and we have already have a significant erosion of trust in institutions, whether that is democracy, institutions at large, elections, the outcomes of the elections, and we have malicious actors, right? So even if we have auditing, independent reviews, etc., which I strongly believe, we still need to also strengthen the election infrastructure and the ecosystem, misinformation, disinformation, control ecosystem as well. And I would like to come to you, Paul, because Europe has been, EU has been ahead of these conversations in terms of regulating some of the misinformation, disinformation activities. Do you believe with the current regulatory landscape, whether it is Digital Services Act, codes of practices against disinformation, and more recently the current text on political advertising, regulation, etc., to be adequate? Or if not, what else do you think should be on the table?
Well, thank you very much for the possibility to participate in this debate today. I think Europe certainly is the leader of democratic action regarding the digital space and artificial intelligence. And whether these measures are adequate, only time will tell. It is probably fair to say that with the political majorities which we have, which still have large elements of, let's say, a neoliberal attitude, you know, as little possible regulation, we are certainly not free from the risk of missing opportunities, in particular in comparison to other industries. I just heard Joshua saying in his previous keynote that he would like programs, AI programs, to be vetted by a regulator before they are made public. And indeed, you know, every new car which comes on the street needs to be vetted. Every medicament of a pharmaceutical company needs to be vetted. Alone in Germany, the pharmaceutical industry spends 8 billion euros a year for testing medicine first before it comes on the market and before going through an approval process by a public authority, while AI in the present regulation going forward in Europe will be completely up to self-vetting by the companies which produce it. So I think we have still a learning way before us. Nothing is perfect. But in particular with the regulation on election advertisement, which does not create additional transparency on the algorithms or their training, but which creates transparency on the messages which are sent to people with targeted advertisement and limits the possibility to target people, beyond what is already as a limitation contained in our general data protection rules, I think we are certainly innovative and at the cutting edge what is being done in the world. I would say the key difference between Europe with these rules, namely, as you mentioned, the Digital Service Act, which obliges big gatekeeper platforms in particular to make sure that they don't become a breeding ground of foreign propaganda and contents which undermines democracy, data protection, which limits the possibility to collect and process personal data for targeting of people, and the regulation on election advertisement, which creates transparency about legitimate, under GDPR, legitimate targeting. With these three elements, plus the code of conduct on disinformation, it is very unlikely, or much less likely than in other jurisdictions like in the United States, that a party or a candidate can win an election in Europe just based on the quality of its digital targeting, the apps, and the message flexibility. That's my great worry, that with the huge amounts of money spent on election advertisement in the next election in the United States, it may not be the quality of argument or the trustworthiness of the politician which decides. It will be the money spent and the quality of the technical applications to target people and to incite them to vote or incite them not to vote, which will be decisive in the election of the President of the United States. And that's basically the end of democracy as we know it.
On that bright note, and we only have 40 minutes, by the way, to cover this election and impact of generative AI on elections and save the democracy. No pressure. Caio, you, on top of your academic work, you actually have on-the-ground experience in Brazil combating spread of electoral disinformation and online platforms. Given the concentration of major AI models, which are usually developed in the US, but deployed beyond the borders, what do you think, what kind of legal mechanism do you think Brazil or other countries who are facing same challenges could employ to ensure the trustworthiness of the process?
Solving the issue in 5 minutes? Well, I think Brazil's current state of regulation of technology, social media technology, even AI, is quite a learning opportunity also for the tech companies. And I'll tell you why. They have been systematically resisting regulation for quite a while. Well, for my example, I've been defending the regulation of social media communication since 2018. Was also the time that Bolsonaro managed to use WhatsApp at scale for broadcast communication, spread disinformation. Curiously enough, the two most effective pieces of disinformation that went around the country are still shallow fakes. They were real images with text messages associated to them that went viral. So I am somewhat concerned about generative AI. I do think that there's a solution for that, which is thinking about the ways we produce, validate, and disseminate information, and therefore create trust. The reason I'm talking about this learning opportunity is because the stakes at each time that companies resist regulation get higher. There is a cost in not having institutional mechanisms to problem solve, to diagnose problems, understand how technology works. And I'm saying technology because in this regard, I think platform regulation and AI regulation share similar issues, especially in terms of fairness, accountability, and so on. So we have two bills going in Brazil, one on platform regulation and one on AI, that converge on this specific point. And currently, the mode that we're facing this challenge socially is what I call regulation by despair. So whenever there's a panic, there's social traction to push for a bill, there's bad research that comes out, there's bad solutions that comes out. Companies have been pouring lots of money into lobbying firms, PR firms, trying to withstand pieces of legislation. And at each time, so first it was the 2018 election, 2020 COVID hit, and then we had invasions of the three powers, and then we had school shootings. And at each one of these cases, something new is added. We need to re-debate everything. And these bills, especially the fake news bill, has been under urgent procedure for 3 years, meaning it can be voted tomorrow. So it's a Schrodinger's cat type of situation. It might be approved, it might be rejected, we don't know. And we're living under this sort of Damocles for 3 years. Now, what's the cost for the platforms as well? We know the cost for society of not having means of achieving solutions, means of understanding how these tools are impacting society. For them as well, is it worth it? This leaves a trust gap. And that, for me, is the greatest concern. Because this trust gap kind of festers, and the tendency is to radical, non-technical, spur-of-the-moment solutions. So I think this situation Brazil is at says a lot to the companies, saying, well, maybe you need regulation, so you have foreseeability as well, and also localized regulation, because these tools that are being developed, mostly in the US, China, they have different uses. They have different impacts when it comes to Brazil, when it comes to any country. Localized solutions also means that someone's not going to show up one day, and this happened, thinking, wow, we could trace all of the messages circulating on WhatsApp and create a database. Can you be more autocratic? And that almost passed. So again, sorry for conflating the AI debate and the platform debate, but I think and I'm concluding, we're at an earlier stage, which is, okay, we need to think about accountability. To do so, we need to understand how these services are impacting us, and to do so, we need means of transparency, of accessing information, producing good readings of the problem.
Thanks so much for that. And I think it's, from what I'm hearing from all of you, is boiling down to trust. And I think we're going to be talking about trust and erosion of trust a lot as well in the coming weeks, months, and years. On that, Maria-Elsa, I want to come to you. UNESCO has done a phenomenal job around the world, not only to protect freedom of speech, increase trust, but also try to build a healthy ecosystem of information. And it's an interesting balance, right, with the moderation of content, if we go to content side, but also moderation of LLMs now, very similar, we're talking about very similar issues, versus freedom of speech. Can you tell us a bit what else UNESCO is doing particularly on this?
Thank you. Is it on? No? Oh, hello? Yeah. Now we said. Thank you very much, Mev. This is a big question, and I'm actually going to start by clarifying that at UNESCO we work with the concept of freedom of expression as described in Article 19 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which actually has been ratified by 173 countries, 6 more signatory countries. So it's actually the vast majority of the world. And that freedom of expression definition is actually constituted by 2 different elements. One is the right to hold opinions without interference. And the second one is the right to seek, impart, receive and impart information. So when we talk about freedom of speech, we keep only one of those elements in place. So I'd like to bring the 4 of them, up front, because and that's why I like what you are saying, conflating the platform and the generative AI, because they are very closely associated. The effects that each of those technologies have are multiplied by being associated with the others. So we generate content, and you distribute it at scale only if you have that kind of a connection to the internet. So, yeah, I mean, these technologies have been having a real big impact on how society is organized, and relate to democracy, and participate in democratic spaces, which are premised essentially on freedom of expression with all these different aspects. So for UNESCO, what we've been trying to do, for this period is actually to look at what are some of the specificities that exist particularly in the Global South. We are talking very much about the fact that there are 54 countries holding elections, but we keep talking about elections in the US and elections in Europe, when actually the fragilities and the vulnerabilities are in the rest of the world. And I want to give a shout out to Linda, which was in the section before, was really calling attention to the fact that it's in the other countries, in the Global South, in the majority of the Global South, that we actually have lack of infrastructure, lack of skills, this tremendous divide, gap that continues to exist, and that actually encompasses the use of these tools as well. So the fact that the electoral management bodies in these countries are actually under-resourced and have been under-resourced, for quite a long time, and are now faced with an additional threat, makes it necessary for us to really talk about how can we support them? How can we build those capacities at scale and on a fast track? Because we are already late to start this kind of work. So for us, for UNESCO, in my division, for example, we do get a big number of countries that we do access. They actually do voluntary assessment of their own digital ecosystems and find exactly where these vulnerabilities exist. For example, on the basis of what we call the Rome X framework, which is the human rights, that ecosystems should be human rights-based, open to all, accessible by all, and multi-stakeholder-led. So we actually have about 44 countries right now that are connected to this and doing assessments of their own ecosystems. And they find where, for example, they need to build inclusive elements, such as, for example, accessibility for persons with disabilities, multilingualism in cyberspace, because a lot of these tools actually operate in English, and particularly they are, how to say that the mitigation measures, when you find them, they actually appear only in English, and then they don't, they are not absorbed into the electoral systems. So we're doing, for example, this is one of the the tools that we have. This element of doing this kind of assessment. We also have quite a lot of guidance for organizations on how to do multi-stakeholder artificial intelligence development. What is it that you need? Because to bring all these voices that should be part of this conversation, particularly the ones that are the most excluded from digital ecosystems. And we also have been working on protection of specific professionals that are impacted tremendously by elections. For example, journalists. The safety of journalists during elections periods, it's suffers quite a lot, particularly when they are exposing, for example, the past of candidates that have a not so savory track record and things like that. So this is one of the elements. The other thing that we are trying to do is actually look at how we can build capacities, build tools, and update the tools that we have. For example, on the MOOC for judges, on AI and the rule of law, we actually have kind of a bit of an outdated MOOC on elections, electoral bodies and digital ecosystems that we are now updating to include, content on generative AI and the associated content with social media, so that we can deploy this as fast as possible. But it's not enough. We actually need to put together kind of a group, that provides this kind of support, at scale and on demand, for electoral bodies that are fragile and are crying for help, around the world. And let me just say one final thing about that. We cannot, Even in countries like the U.S. and European countries, we cannot forget that foreign interference in elections in other countries will get back to you as well. So worry about that. Help us to build these tools, because this is a serious business that we all need to be, supporting democracy everywhere. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think I'll transition from your last point on foreign interference and malicious actors as well, because that's one of the things that is keeping me up at night. We're not only talking about foreign actors as in state actors who are behind us, but also malicious actors who are using the worst angels of our nature, of our societies, and polarization within the society as well, existing polarizations and radicalizations within the society as well. I know of researchers who are keeping an eye on, for example, development of LLMs based on 4chan material, and how that is going to disperse or already being dispersed in dark web space. Or things like personalized targeted campaigns on deepfakes and disinformation. So when I think of impact of generative AI and elections and trust, to use Paul's optimistic approach, things that come to my mind is, online disinformation for sure. Very credible deepfakes. Misinformation, as Senator Klobuchar was saying yesterday, about if someone is trying to use generative AI systems to access the information, they might not get accurate information from that sense as well. The personalized, not a single deepfake spread out to mass population, but your own very personalized targeted deepfakes that are tailored according to your perceptions as well. And the final one that comes to my mind is online surveillance of certain figures through LLMs and generative AI systems. What else comes to your mind? And this one, I would like to keep it open. Please feel free to jump in as well.
I just want to jump in on what you're saying, because what you're describing there is unacceptable in the political realm, but entirely rewarded on the economic realm. Yeah. So and that we have to remember that this micro-targeting on the basis of personal characteristics or preferences, etc., is actually companies make money out of that. So it makes it really hard for us to actually develop the kinds of tools that curtail one without curtailing the other. So we really need to think about business models in a different way, because they actually have tremendous impact when these business models are on the other side of democracy, on rule of law, and they are affecting this kind of element. So we really need to be serious about that.
Can I compliment? Yeah. So when thinking of disinformation and elections, I think the hyper-realistic content is absolutely an issue, but it's my secondary concern. Because fundamentally, these tools are the new way we circulate information in society. We organize information in society. So if we're using chat bots for navigating information, we're compacting that information according to a series of procedures, coded procedures, that we can't fathom what's behind that. That was already an issue with Google search, for example. Well, everyone knows no one goes past the first page on Google search, but you're having different options still. We can discuss a lot of those problems. Now we're collapsing that even further. And returning to the issues of accountability, supporting what other people here said, if we as society don't know how that information is being organized, we can't contest it. One example I really like, at one point, someone asked ChatGPT who was Pelé. Pelé was the biggest soccer player in Brazilian history, our king. And ChatGPT answered, he was the Minister of Sport. To me, that's disinformation. That is true, but you cannot reduce Pelé to that figure. His historical relevance is much greater in his contribution to sport. Picture that with other matters, with political importance. I think that's the major issue. So, sorry, just to finish the manipulated images facet, I think that we can do through media literacy and getting people to know it's out there. The other one, we need to crack the box open. Sorry.
I absolutely agree with the things that both of you have just said. And I think it's worth noting that while we could spend the entire time on this panel going through a laundry list of things that we're worried about when it comes to generative AI, I'm actually much less concerned about what's on that list than I am on the fact that than I am about the fact that we spend so much time focused on generating those lists, focused on thinking about what should we be afraid of, right? What should we distrust? And that is not to say that we should not be having these sorts of critical discussions. We absolutely have to work to identify these risks. But what I'm much, much, much more concerned about, and in part, right, because as you pointed out, it's much less the deep fakes that are a concern than the cheap fakes, right? It's not that generative AI is transforming the concerns about disinformation, about information manipulation. These are age-old. What is being transformed is the sense of overall trust throughout so many societies. People believe that no matter what you put in front of them, they cannot believe it, they can't trust it, unless it comes from the one or two single sources that fit within their preconceived ideological sense of worldview, and they will not turn to anything else. And so I think the starting point for all of this has to be, how do we support the trustworthy sources of information, right? The trustworthy journalists, local information and news provision all around the world, so that people feel these are the folks that I can go to when I have a concern, when I have a question about whether or not the thing that I'm looking at online, whether or not what I've just put into ChatGPT and it's turned around and produced to me as the single answer about Pele or whatever else it is. Here are the people that I know I can go and ask reliably, or when they tell me this is the reliable information I can trust. But we're in a world where no one trusts anything, and that's in no small part because we continue to sow that sense of fear and distrust. And I just really want to encourage us to be a bit more thoughtful and think about how we can communicate about risks around generative AI without contributing to this overall climate of fear and distrust.
Well, if I may,
Paul, I was going to just pass to you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on this, I think the discourse of trusted AI and trusted technology leads in the wrong direction. At least after 1968, we have learned to teach our children to be critical of the press. Media literacy means the ability to analyze publications in a critical way. And I think this is what we have to maintain also in the technological age. It's very important to be critical of power, whether it's state power or technological power in private hands. So I must say, let's talk nice so that we trust more the technological environment, or for that matter, the democratic environment. I think that's a huge mistake. We need people who are critical of power. And I would agree with the plea, which we have heard already on the panel, that we need institutions and rules to maintain freedom. It's a fallacy to believe that the greatest freedom is the absence of rules, which are also enforced with a hard hand. So we need institutions and rules which are binding on private parties, especially when we come to important moments of formal democracy, such as voting. And they need to be enforced with a hard hand, also in particular towards the powerful platforms which shape the information environment in those moments of, let's say, the democratic vote, and which make it possible to manipulate people by micro-targeting in particular. So particular in these moments, the absence of rules, and this is the same story with party and election and political financing, and political advertisement. The absence of rules is a huge damage to democracy. We need democracy which defends itself against its enemies. And I would say, yes, democracy has enemies outside. There is an issue of foreign interference, but the much bigger enemies of democracy are inside, and they use the normally available technologies which are on the market. And as one of the panelists said, others are making huge money with this. And so I think these are mechanisms about which we have to talk more and not less. And we have to be extremely critical of these mechanisms in order to arrive at a point that people are ready to support the hard rules of law, which are enforceable and which are necessary to maintain democracy. Neither transparency alone, nor supposed freedom through the absence of rules will save democracy and is indeed conducive to democracy. But the opposite is the case. And this idea that transparency is solving all problems, I would also not share. We are not able as individuals, only on the basis of transparency, to understand all the manipulation which big corporate brings to the voting box. We need strong public authorities who control the correct voting and who control also the election advertisement and also the party financing. The idea that we just have transparency rules all over the place and then everything will be fine is just naive. And that's what we have learned. And so far, these hard lessons have not led to actions in many parts of the world. And I would agree with the last speakers. We must move on from doubts and discourse and talk to action to defend democracy.
Can I respond very quickly? Because I think there may be a bit of a misperception simply because I'm the one American sitting on the panel here, that I'm actually sharing the view that we need less regulation, that transparency is the stopping point, and crucially that we should work on building trust without critical inquiry. I don't believe any of those things. I think we need much stronger regulation. I work day in and day out with your colleagues at the Commission on development and implementation of the Digital Services Act. I think these things are absolutely essential, but I want us to be thoughtful about the larger discourse around, the AI environment. It is not my intention to say we shoot for transparency, no regulation, and that's the stopping point. It is fundamentally that we think more critically among ourselves about how we talk about these problems and risks going forward so that we don't contribute to an overall environment where people feel they can't trust anything, including the very political institutions that are being supported to develop these regulations.
And on that note, I want to follow up with a similar question as well. Especially when we look at the electoral, focusing on the electoral period, are there any other restrictive measures that we should think of for those periods, focusing on the elections and election integrity?
Well, this is being largely discussed at home, so we haven't pinpointed the exact solutions yet. It's on this fake news bill. What I'd like to bring, adding to this discussion as well, is that I'm totally in favor of institutional regulation. I'm defending the bill, participating. I do think that it is also very limited. So the issue with disinformation is, if anything, it shows us the challenge of filling the requirements for institutional responses, attributing liability. You're looking at a complex web of tweets, and I won't go on to that issue, but elections next year in Brazil, over 5,300 cities. How are we going to institutionally respond with all the bureaucratic measures in time? Absolutely not feasible. And that's why I think we turn to tech literacy, media literacy, name it what you will. I do think that social norms play an important role. the people will eventually vote against someone who they think is infringing on norms as well, hopefully. About specific measures, I think, that can be done. I'll refer to one that I've participated in, and another one which I think is useful and hopefully adopted. One was we teamed up with social media creators to teach agnostic checking methods, open source investigation tools. You can fall asleep before I finish that sentence, but we used social media creators with tens of millions of followers, and we managed to get that information to over 2 million young people in Brazil prior to the elections. We teamed up with authorities as well. All the staff of the Supreme Court, regional courts, all of the courts who are dying for this information, and got them prepared as well. So we need to know how to handle technology. Regarding restrictions themselves, advertising restrictions, transparency on advertising money, transparency on political and non-political advertising. I think we, again, I'm talking about my own country, we have a few measures that we do for, let's say, offline advertising. We need to transpose that. I mean, you can't advertise politicians the day before, the 24 hours before. Maybe you shouldn't be doing that online as well. We have a huge issue with the flows of money in these platforms. And that's where I think transparency is not the solution. It is the means of achieving institutional solutions, detecting causality, attributing liability, and so on.
To jump in on what you're saying, and I want to follow up on what Paul was talking about, in terms of building capacities, that we need strong, capable institutions. And one of the things that we are doing in UNESCO is exactly, we developed recently an AI and digital transformation competency framework for civil servants. And we've been piloting and applying, this kind of capacity development, particularly with, the exact kind of frontline institutions that really need, urgently this kind of capacity. So we've been working with a series of countries already on that. On what you're saying, about the fact that we have legislation already, we have regulation already on a series of elements that impact, on how elections should be done. But what we think we need is essentially kind of acceptable norms that go everywhere, because these platforms are global. The elections are, within a particular jurisdiction, but we have to have at least a minimum in which we all agree. What are the shared norms that we're going to have in distribution, generation and distribution of content? And just recently, UNESCO launched the guidelines for governance of digital platforms that actually calls for transparency, accountability, independent oversight, and user empowerment, because those are the minimum, that we need to have. Yeah, so.
Thanks so much. And Marielza did really came prepared with all the props. I have been informed that we have an online question as well. All right, fine, okay. So before we go to the online question in 5 minutes, I want to ask, your remarks, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, of where you think the future focus should be. You mentioned many of the measures that we can take, and where our focus could lie. Where do you think we can make the most impact? Whether we're working with the regulators, whether we're working with frontline workers. And maybe Paul, I start with you on this one. Where we can be more, where we can have the more impactful hook?
Yeah, I think in Western societies, the biggest problem where it all starts is the comprehensive profiling of people in these huge profiles with hundreds of parameters, which then makes it possible to address them in a very micro-targeted way. And these profiles, they really are in total contradiction of the principle that in a free society, the means of communication must be free of surveillance. we are being totally surveilled in all our activities on the internet, whether our bilateral or multilateral communication, also in the public and private communication, and this becomes part of our profile. And so I think we have to think in the next legislature in Europe, and certainly also in the United States and elsewhere, about a blanco interdiction of maintaining such profiles. Because the existence of these profiles alone gives the people the feeling that they are blackmailable, because of all the things which are in the profile, and of course they are the key tool for this devastating micro-targeting, which is used not only in the political context, but also to defraud people and to screw them over the table in business and commercial relations. So I think that's the main thing. The second thing is the transparency of financing of advertisement activities. We must follow the money, and rules on financing in election times. And these rules have to be enforced, and there must be investigative powers. And let me say, as a third point, I can't help it, but my feeling is that the third element is that we have to invite also big tech and the technological community to be in their discourse more supportive of democratic process. The law is the most noble speaking act of democracy. And we can have as many specific laws and enforcement measures to support democracy as we want if the technological complex and business continues its discourse of talking down the law as an impediment to innovation, as a cost factor, as something bad. This is destroying democracy from the inside. So it's very easy to see in the end, if you have a legislative process, who are the friends of democracy and who actually are not, because they would like to do the rules by themselves. That's the wet dream of those who say, oh, we do it all by our community rules, we do it with ethics, we do it with self-regulation. This type of discourse has been undermining democracy for decades, and now we're starting to pay the price at a moment where, in addition, the threat to democracy comes very directly from the technology which those people which also support this type of discourse have introduced. So we have to regain the primacy of democracy over technology and business model also by demasking this very corrosive business discourse, which is constantly dripping against democracy. This has to end.
I don't know how to follow it myself. I don't know if you can hear the applauses from the room, but yes, if we make democracy and human rights as the Northern Star, then who follows? I think that will be the transparency. That will be shedding the light on the motives and intentions as well. I'm looking at Amanda.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
We have a question from the virtual audience, and maybe it can help wrap up this amazing panel. The question is from John Laprise. He's asking, how do we incentivize signal information and disincentivize noise disinformation? We have 5 extra minutes for this.
From my perspective, this goes back to something that you said very early on, right? Which is that the economics behind all of this mean that there is incentive for disinformation. And I tie this back to what Paul just said in terms of needing to center democratic and human rights values first and foremost. And I think that also, right, then has an additional layer on top of it, meaning that we need to find ways to empower democratic institutions, right? I think about bodies, here in the US, literally here in DC, that have essentially been so hobbled that this sort of just the Federal Election Commission, right, being one very concrete example that has so little ability to actually exercise the powers that it has been given by Congress, that this democratic institution cannot do its job to work to help incentivize, right, the appropriate information as opposed to, right, the noise, the disinformation. And so it's one, thinking about the economics, but 2, prioritizing the values first, and then 3, in lockstep with that, empowering the democratic institutions to make sure they can do their jobs first and foremost to work to build the other 2.
Tough question, but adding to that, I'm not so confident there is a perfect dichotomy between information, disinformation. I mean, obviously there is disinformation campaigns and the intentional misuse, but information, once it's thrown out in space, it is there and it changes and it's highly contextual, and you have contextual collapse as it jumps through other platforms. So this is the point where I think institutions have a very important signaling effect. We need to have answers for the intentional disinformation made at scale, made in electoral times, made by big actors. That needs forms of accountability, of bringing them to check. And answering that question, and also Murphy's question, I'd say we need to turn to 2 solutions in terms of passing legislation. I think we have important milestones that are done at global scales because they are reproduced, and not only DSA but also GDPR, net neutrality, all of that feeds into the issues that we're having. But we also need localized solutions, and this is something that is very hard because for global South countries it's very convenient to say, let's just bargain for what the Europeans did, they're already doing the paperwork, we're going to manage, and give up the local solutions. And it turns out that the sort of inventions that happen in the global South come back to bite. For example, I have friends working with disinformation here in the US, extremely concerned with how the messaging apps are being used by the Latino community. The services are global, the experiences are local, and the problems, the laws, but also the problems hop around a lot. So I'd say in terms of institutional response, these are the 2 big answers I'd have.
Well, let me see. One of the things that we are seeing now, is estimates that about in 2026, literally, 3 years from now, we're going to have, I think, more than 50% of the content on the internet generated by bots. It's actually going to be, a flood of noise and misinformation, disinformation, hallucination, that we need to be prepared for that. One of the things that I think we are going to have to do is to reward and respect again, the content creation, and make sure that we actually reward the appropriate content creations. One of the things that I saw a few months ago is that in Spotify had found 16 million bot-generated songs in its platform. That Amazon, the largest cloud and company like that, they actually were struggling to eliminate bot-generated books from its own platform. But why are these things being generated? Because they actually monetize noise by placing it together with actual relevant content. But that's stealing from the mouths of journalists that actually do the news, and then somebody else scrapes that and puts that back together. It's stealing from artists that actually create music, that create that write books, and then don't get rewarded for that, and so on and so forth. And for scientists, for educators, all of that. We need to stop, to stop disregarding these professions as if they were not worth, the amount that we need to have. So, I mean, I'm pleading for that for now. So that's how we combat that noise.
Thank you so much, and I know our time is up. I really appreciate all of your comments. your insights. Like I said at the beginning, this is not relatively new, but I think there's a lot for all of us, as well as giving power to the people, trusting in the process, trusting in democracy as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the team.